Next on Book TV, Steven Pinker argues we're living in the most peaceable era in human existence, and that through the spread of government, literacy, trade, and cosmopolitanism, humans have been able to increasingly control the inner demons that lead us to violence. This is about an hour and 15 minutes.
Believe it or not, and I know most people do not, violence has been in decline for long stretches of time, and we today are probably living in the most peaceful time in our species' existence. The decline of violence has not been steady, it has not brought violence down to zero, and it is not guaranteed to continue. Nonetheless, it's a persistent historical development, visible on scales from millennia to years, from wars and genocides to the spanking of children and the treatment of animals. This evening, I'm going to discuss 6 major historical declines of violence, their immediate causes in terms of particular historical events of the era that a historian would single out, but also their ultimate causes in terms of general historical forces interacting with human nature. The first major decline I call the pacification process. Until about 5,000 years ago, humans everywhere lived in anarchy without central government. What was life like in this state of nature? This is a question on which people have had opinions for many centuries. Thomas Hobbes in 1651 famously said that in a state of nature the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. 100 years later, Jean-Jacques Rousseau countered that in a state of nature nothing can be more gentle than man in his primitive state. Well, both of these men were pontificating from the armchair. Neither of them knew anything about what life was like in a state of nature. And today we can do better. There are 2 methods to measure death rates in non-state societies. One of them is forensic archaeology, a kind of CSI Paleolithic. Namely, what proportion of prehistoric skeletons have signs of violent trauma, such as bashed-in skulls, decapitated skeletons, arrowheads embedded in femurs, fractures on ulnar bones, the kind of fracture you get when you hold up your arm to ward off a blow, and mummies found with ropes tied around their necks. Well, if unfortunately, the space won't accommodate visuals, but I have a graph of 20 prehistoric archaeological sites at which archaeologists have tried to estimate the proportion of skeletons with signs of violent trauma. They range from 0% to 60%, and the average is about 15%. Let's compare that 15% figure with those of some state societies. For example, the United States and Europe through the 20th century, the comparable rate of death from warfare was about 1%. If we try to get the worst possible figure by throwing in all the war deaths, all the deaths from genocides, and all the deaths from man-made famines throughout the world during the 20th century, the figure is about 3%. The figure for the world in 2005, for the most recent decade, on the graph is invisible because it's far less than a pixel. It's about 3/10 of 1%. The second way of estimating the rate of violent death in non-state societies is by examining ethnographic vital statistics. That is, what percentage of people living in extant or recent non-state societies, hunter-gatherer and hunter-horticultural and other tribal societies, die at the hands of their fellow humans. Again, the graph that I would display, if I was displaying graphs, shows 27 societies for which such figures are available. They range, and here I've plotted them using the conventional criminologist scale of violent deaths per 100,000 people per year. The deaths rates range from 0 to 1,500, but the average is about 500 deaths per 100,000 people per year. That is 1/2 of 1%. Again, let's compare that figure, a bit more than 500, with the corresponding figure for some states. And again, we'll stack the deck against states by choosing the most violent states in the most violent eras in their history, such as Germany in the 20th century. 2 world wars, the figure is about 150. That's a similar figure to what we have for Russia in the 20th century, which went through 2 world wars, a revolution, and a civil war. Japan in the 20th century was closer to 60. The United States in the 20th century was less than 3. And the world in the 20th century is about a third of a death per 100,000 per year. Sorry, that's the world in the first decade of the 21st century. The world in the 20th century, throwing in all of the world wars, genocides, and man-made famines, is about 60 per 100,000 per year, far less than the 524 per 100,000 per year that we find in non-state peoples. Well, what was the immediate cause of this change in rate of violent death? The most likely one is the rise and expansion of states. Students of history are familiar with the various paxes, that is, peaces imposed by an empire or hegemon, the Pax Romana, Pax Islamica, Pax Britannica, Pax Sinica, and so on. When a state imposes control over a territory, it tends to try to stamp out tribal raiding and feuding. It's not because that this comes from a benevolent interest in the welfare of the subject peoples, but rather all of this raiding and feuding is a nuisance to the overlords because it just settles scores among them and shuffles resources around at a net loss to the overlords, who would just as soon keep the people alive to provide them with taxes and tributes and slaves and serfs. Just as a farmer has an interest in preventing his cattle from killing each other, because it's just a dead loss to him, so an emperor or warlord will try to keep his subject peoples from killing each other at a loss to himself. The second historical transition in violence has been called the civilizing process, and it refers to the transition between life in the Middle Ages, and I have a lovely woodcut here of knights cudgeling, stabbing, and putting daggers through peasants, and the early modern period. It turns out that in many parts of Europe, homicide statistics go back hundreds of years to the 14th and often the 13th century. And if you plot homicide statistics over time, over the centuries, you find that they plummet from an average rate of about 35 per 100,000 per year to the contemporary European rate of 1 per 100,000 per year, a decline by about a factor of 35. This is one of many graphs that I'm going to ask you to imagine, which consists of a jagged line that meanders from the top left of the graph when statistics first started to be kept for the category of violence I'll be discussing, and meanders its way down to the bottom right of the graph, which represents the era in which we are now living. And that is true for homicide in Europe. The immediate cause of the European homicide decline was identified by the German sociologist Norbert Elias in his book called The Civilizing Process, namely that during the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity, there was a consolidation of central states and kingdoms out of the European patchwork of baronies and principalities and duchies and fiefs. As a result, criminal justice was nationalized, and a life of feuding warlords, they were called knights, but today we would call them warlords, was replaced by the king's justice, where some genius had the idea that if instead of the family of a victim collecting blood money from the family of a killer, if it was the state that collected that money, it would be a constant revenue stream. And in fact, the king sent a representative to every town once a year to tally the number of homicides so that the king could collect compensation from the family of the perpetrator. This agent of the crown was called the coroner, which is why we still call the official who assesses causes of deaths the coroner. Aside from the consolidation of states, the transition from Middle Ages to modernity saw a growing infrastructure of commerce. Institutions such as money and finance and contracts that could be enforced and recognized within the boundaries of these newly consolidated states, and technologies that lubricated trade, such as transportation, better roads, better bridles for horses, instruments of timekeeping, and other technologies. The result was that zero-sum plunder, where the plunderer's gain was the victim's loss, was increasingly replaced by positive-sum trade, where both parties to a voluntary exchange can benefit. The third major transition can be illustrated by some of the methods that the early states used to impose peace on their kingdoms. Punishments such as breaking on the wheel, where the victim would be tied to a wagon wheel and the executioner would smash his or her bones, her arms and legs with a sledgehammer, at which point the victim would be hoisted up on the wagon wheel and left to die of exposure and shock. Burning at the stake, sawing in half from the crotch up, impalement through the rectum, and clawing the flesh with iron hooks. However, in a remarkably narrow slice of time, centered in the 18th century, torture as a form of punishment was abolished by every major country, including the United States in its famous prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment in the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution. This was part of a global movement to abolish judicial torture. The 18th century also saw the abolition of other institutionalized forms of violence that we now consider barbaric, such as the frivolous application of the death penalty. England in the 18th century had 222 capital offenses on the book, including poaching, counterfeiting, robbing a rabbit warren, being in the company of gypsies, and, quote, strong evidence of malice in a child aged 7 to 14 years of age. This was not just a theoretical possibility, but was carried out with relish. Samuel Johnson, for example, in his diary, speaks about a 7-year-old girl who was hanged for stealing a petticoat. By 1861, the list of capital crimes was down to 4, basically high treason, murder, and some of its variations. In the United States, too, there was an enormous list of capital crimes in the colonial and early independent period. I have a graph showing the percentage of American executions for crimes other than murder, and it meanders from close to 100% in the colonial period down to pretty much 0%. Nowadays, the only crimes against people that are punishable by execution other than murder are conspiracy to commit murder. The death penalty itself was put on death row starting in the 18th century, and it began a gradual and then a precipitous wave of abolitions of capital punishment. Nowadays, the United States is the only Western democracy that even has the death penalty, and even then only in 2/3 of the states. And even then, to say that the United States has the death penalty is a bit of a fiction. If you look at the number of American executions as a proportion of the population, it has been plunging, and so now the graph hugs the floor. Nowadays, about 50 people are executed every year in a country that has close to 17,000 homicides. So even here, in the backwater of death penalty abolitions, the death penalty is a shadow of its former self. Other abolitions during the Humanitarian Revolution include witch hunts, religious persecution, such as burning heretics at the stake, dueling, blood sports, debtors' prisons, and of course slavery, where the end of the 18th century saw the beginning of a tidal wave of abolitions of slavery. In the United States, again, a bit behind the curve, not doing it until the 1860s, but today, for the first time in history, no, slavery is not legal anywhere in the world. It used to be that slavery was legal everywhere in the world, and indeed endorsed as part of the natural order of things by the ancient Greeks, by the Bible, and just about everyone else. What were the immediate causes of the humanitarian revolution? Well, I've looked at a number of candidates, and the most plausible in terms of something that happened before the humanitarian revolution was advances in printing and literacy. Printing was the only industry that showed an increase in productivity prior to the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, and the cost of printing a book plunged in the 16th and 17th centuries. The result was an exponential increase in the number of books that were published in European countries, and there were more people who could read them. In the 18th century, for the first time, a majority of Englishmen were literate. Well, why should literacy matter? The causes are those that we abbreviate with the term the Enlightenment. For one thing, knowledge replaced superstition and ignorance. As Voltaire said, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. As your society becomes smart enough to debunk various forms of hogwash, such as that heretics go to hell, Jews poison wells, witches cause crop failures, children are possessed, Africans are brutish, kings rule by divine right, and so on, it's bound to undermine many traditional rationales for violence. Also, literacy can be part of a general current towards cosmopolitanism, also encouraged by technologies such as ships that allow the easy movement of and mixing of peoples. And it is plausible that as people spend more of their waking life reading fiction and history and journalism, they start to inhabit other people's minds, see the world from their point of view, therefore developing more empathy and less cruelty. If you reflexively try to imagine what it's like to be some other person, maybe you're a little less likely to enjoy seeing them disemboweled. The fourth historical transition had to wait another 150 years or so, and it's a development that, borrowing from the political scientist John Gaddis, I call the long peace. And it speaks to the common conception that the 20th century was the most violent in history. Now, interestingly, people who repeat that claim never back it up with any numbers from any century other than the 20th century. And it's highly likely that that claim is fallacious. Now, it certainly is true that the Second World War was the deadliest event in human history in terms of the absolute number of people who were killed. On the other hand, the world had a whole lot more people in the 20th century than it had in past centuries, and we record and care about war deaths a lot more in the 20th century than people did in previous centuries. If you try to estimate, admittedly retrospectively, the death tolls from atrocities in past centuries, and you scale them by the size of the world's population at the time, it's not so clear that the 20th century was the worst. I've taken figures from several atrocitologists, as they call themselves, such as Matthew White from his forthcoming book, The Great Big Book of Horrible Things, where he lists the 100 worst things that people have ever done to each other that we know of. I divided them by estimates of the world's population at the time, and what happens is that World War II comes in ninth place, and World War I doesn't even make the top 10. That other atrocities such as the Mongol invasions, the African slave trade, the annihilation of Native Americans, and basically every time a dynasty fell in China, there could be several tens of millions of people killed. And if you look at the worst atrocities throughout human history plotted over time, they pretty much form an even cloud for 2,500 years. If you then zoom in on the last 500 years, where we could do a little bit better, instead of just plotting the atrocities, we can add them up for the centuries. The political scientist Jack Levy has done that for a particular category of mass violence, namely great power wars. Wars that embroil the 800-pound gorillas of the day, the largest states, and the ones that in fact do far more damage when they get into a war than all the little wars combined. If you plot the proportion of years between 1500 and 2000 in which the great powers of the day fought each other, you see a curve in which for the early centuries, the great powers were pretty much always at war. There are many points in the curve that hit 100% of the years in a quarter century. Now the great powers are virtually never at war. The last great power war was the Korean War that ended in 1953. If you plot the duration of wars involving a great power, on at least one side, the duration goes down. We used to have things like the 30 Years' War, the 80 Years' War, the 100 Years' War. In the 20th century, we had the Six-Day War. If you plot the frequency of wars involving a great power, that is how many new wars are started every year, again, you have a curve that works its way downward from 1500 to the present. However, there is one curve that goes in the opposite direction. If you look for most of its history, if you plot the deadliness of wars involving a great power, that is not how many wars are started, but how many people are killed once a war does begin, that goes in the other direction. That goes upward. That is, nations got better and better at killing larger and larger numbers of soldiers until 1945, in which that curve does an abrupt U-turn. And since 1945, wars for the first time in history have become both less numerous and less deadly per nation year of war. If you then combine these two figures, you multiply the number of wars by the deadliness of each war, you get a zigzaggy curve, but the crucial point is that the last point on that curve, representing the last 25 years, in fact the last 2 points, the last 50 years, are hitting all-time lows over the last 500 years. This is the phenomenon called the long peace, namely that in the last two-thirds of a century, since 1945, there's been a historically unprecedented decline in interstate war, wars between countries. To be exact, and here are some statistics that are very easy to convey, they don't need a graph because they all consist of the number 0. There were no wars between the Soviet Union and the United States, which may sound unexceptionable today, but every expert predicted that World War III was inevitable. Many people in the room grew up with the experts assuring us that it was only a matter of time before the US and USSR duked it out. No nuclear weapons have been used since Nagasaki in wartime, again confounding every expert prediction. As I've mentioned, there have been no wars between great powers since 1953, probably the longest span of time without a great power war since the Roman Empire. There have been no wars between Western European countries. Again, your first reaction might be to say, well, ho-hum, of course there haven't. No one expects, say, France and Germany to go to war. What a concept. Or Sweden and Russia. But of course, any student of European history knows that this was the rule, not the exception, until the precipitous decline of interstate war after 1945. There have been no wars between developed countries, that is, the 45 or so countries with the highest GDP per capita. Now, what about the rest of the world? Well, there is a fifth major decline of violence that I call the new peace, that refers to the rest of the world. So what's happened if we set aside the great powers, the Western European countries, the rich countries, what was the rest of the world doing? Well, there was a worldwide decline in the number of interstate wars where one country declares war against another. However, there has been a huge increase in civil wars. It mainly exploding starting in the 1960s when newly independent states with inept governments were challenged by insurgent movements, and both sides were armed and financed and egged on by the Cold War superpowers. However, since 1991, even the number of civil wars has declined with the end of the Cold War. And one now has to ask, if the number of interstate wars went down, the number of civil wars went up, which ones kill more people? And the answer is very clear. Interstate wars kill far more people, or at least they have since the late 1940s. There's nothing like a pair of great powers chucking artillery shells at each other, bombing each other's cities, sending massive number of tanks to do battle, to rack up high body counts in a hurry. In comparison, some teenagers armed with AK-47s can surely make life miserable in the local areas in which they work, but they simply don't do the same amount of nationwide damage. And again, I have a graph showing the deadliness of interstate and civil wars over the last 55 years. The number of deaths in interstate war per year of war has plummeted. For civil wars, it's just a slight increase followed by a decrease. If you then add up the deaths from all sorts of war, that is interstate and civil wars, what you find is a bumpy decline with peaks for the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Iran-Iraq War. But in the last 10 years, the figures hug the floor. They're basically a narrow little stripe. And since you can't see the picture, I'll describe it in numbers. During the worst years of World War II, the death rate from war was about 300 per 100,000 per year. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, it had fallen to about 22 per 100,000 per year. In this past decade, it has been at 1/3 of a death per 100,000 people per year, using a constant yardstick of battle deaths. And this is the phenomenon I've been calling the new peace. So it would be a bit of an exaggeration, but not too much of an exaggeration, to say that the dream of the 1960s folk singers is almost coming true. That is, the world is almost putting an end to war. What are the immediate causes of the long peace and the new peace? Well, one influential hypothesis came from Immanuel Kant in 1795 in his essay Perpetual Peace, in which he proposed that democracy, interstate trade, and an international community all would drive down the likelihood of war. Recently, a pair of political scientists, Bruce Russett and John O'Neill, have tested Kant's hypothesis by measuring these factors and showing, first of all, that all of them have increased in the second half of the 20th century, and all of them are statistical predictors of peace. The number of democracies exceeded the number of autocracies around 1990. And has shown an increase. The amount of international trade skyrocketed after the end of the Second World War. The membership in intergovernmental organizations has steadily increased throughout the 20th century. And especially since 1990, there has been a huge increase in the number of international peacekeepers, that is, soldiers with blue helmets and other neutral parties who get in the way between opposing forces. They don't always prevent a reigniting of hostilities into war, but they do far more often than when there are no peacekeepers. Finally, the sixth historical decline of violence I call the rights revolutions, which refers to the targeting of violence at smaller scales against vulnerable minorities such as racial minorities, women, children, homosexuals, and animals. During the post-war period, the civil rights movement put an end to lynchings, which used to take place at a rate of about 150 per year. That went down by the 1950s to 0 per year. Hate crime murders of blacks have been in the single digits since they were first recorded and have since then plunged to about 1 per year. Non-lethal hate crimes against blacks, such as intimidation and assault, have declined since they were first measured. The kinds of racist attitudes that in the past would license outbursts of violence, such as genocides and pogroms, have been in steady decline. For example, in the United States, if you ask white people Would you move if a black family moved in next door? Do you believe that black and white students should go to separate schools? Do you think that the income gap between blacks and whites is due to lower ability or to lower motivation? All of those racist attitudes have been in steady decline. Many of them have fallen so low that they're in the realm of crank opinion, and the pollsters have dropped them from their surveys. The women's rights movements have seen an 80% decline in rape since the early 70s, when the statistics were first kept. Also a precipitous decline in domestic violence, a strong decline in the most extreme forms of domestic violence, namely uxoricide and mariticide, that is the killing of wives and husbands. Although here I must add that the decline has been far steeper for wives killing husbands than husbands killing wives. The women's movement has been very, very good for men. The children's rights movement has seen a steady decline in the number of American states that have corporal punishment, or paddling, a decline in every Western country in the degree of approval of spanking, a decline in physical abuse and sexual abuse of children since statistics were first kept, and a decline in school violence such as fighting and non-fatal crimes. The gay rights movement has seen an increase in the number of states that have decriminalized homosexuality, both states worldwide and American states. A decline in anti-gay attitudes, such as whether homosexuality is morally wrong, should be made illegal, or whether gay people should be denied equal opportunity, and a decline in at least one category of anti-gay hate crimes. The animal rights movement has seen a decline in hunting, a rise in vegetarianism, and a decline in the percentage of motion pictures in which animals were harmed. Well, all of this raises a question. Why have all of these graphs meandered downward over the course of history? Why have there been so many different declines of violence at different scales of magnitude and time? Well, one possibility is that human nature has changed and that somehow people have lost their inclinations toward violence. I consider this an unlikely explanation. For one thing, toddlers continue to hit, kick, and bite. Little boys continue to play fight. Grown-up boys and many girls enjoy various forms of vicarious violence, such as murder mysteries, Greek tragedies, Shakespearean dramas, video games, ice hockey, and movies starring a certain ex-governor of California. And a number of social psychologists have assessed the prevalence of homicidal fantasies. They've asked people the question, have you ever fantasized about killing someone you don't like? Well, it turns out that about 15% of women and about a third of men frequently fantasize about killing people they don't like. More than 60% of women and 3/4 of men at least occasionally fantasize about killing people they don't like. And the rest of them are lying. A more likely possibility is that human nature is extraordinarily complex, and it comprises both inclinations toward violence and inclinations that counteract them, what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, from which I took the title of my own book, and that historical circumstances have increasingly favored our peaceable inclinations, our better angels. Well, what are these forces in conflict, fighting it out inside the skull? I think that violence is not a single psychological category. We have a number of psychologically and even neurobiologically very distinct motives that can result in violence. There's sheer exploitation, the use of violence as a means to an end when some living thing is an obstacle in the path of something that you want, which we see played out in violence such as rape, plunder, conquest, and the elimination of rivals. Very different from that is the quest for dominance, the drive for individuals to climb the pecking order and be alpha male, and the analogous drive among groups for ethnic, racial, national, or religious supremacy. The very large category of revenge and moralistic violence, which results in vendettas, rough justice, and cruel punishments. And perhaps the biggest category are consist of violence pursued in quest of an ideology, such as militant religions, nationalism, fascism, Nazism, and communism, which can license vast outlays of violence because of a pernicious utopian cost-benefit analysis. If your ideology holds out the prospect of a future world that is infinitely good forever, well, what are you entitled to do in order to attain that world? Well, you can commit pretty much as much violence as you want, and you're still going to be making the world a better place by this cost-benefit analysis. Also, imagine that you have been vouchsafed with the one true faith according to which there is a utopia to which you can strive. And there are some people who hear about this utopia, but they just stubbornly reject it. Well, how evil are they? Well, you do the math. Arbitrarily evil. And that is why the tales of the distribution of massive violence tend to be pushed outward by utopian ideologies. Well, what do we have on the other side to counteract these motives for violence? What are our better angels? There's self-control, the ability to anticipate the consequences of our behavior and to inhibit violent impulses. There's empathy, the ability to feel others' pain. There's the moral sense, which is a family of intuitions, some of which, like tribalism, authoritarianism, and Puritanism, can actually increase violence. But at least one flavor of the moral sense, the drive for fairness, can counteract violence. And then there's reason, the cognitive faculties that allow us to engage in objective, detached analysis. Well, if we have then these inclinations toward violence on the one hand, these inhibitions against violence on the other, what has tipped the balance over the course of history? What has brought out our better angels? The first possibility was proposed by Hobbes in his book called The Leviathan. A Leviathan, referring to a state and judicial system with a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, can eliminate the incentives for exploitative attack by punishing it, can thereby reduce the need for deterrence and vengeance, can circumvent the self-serving biases by which both sides to a dispute always believe that they are on the side of the angels and that the other side is wicked or stupid or stubborn or all three. People we know from social psychology research exaggerate their adversaries' malevolence and exaggerate their own innocence. This can stoke cycles of revenge unless you have a disinterested third party deciding who's to blame and meting out the penalties. Some historical evidence that the Leviathan has been a pacifying force consists of the first two transitions that I discussed this evening, the pacifying and civilizing effects of states, and the fact that we can watch these movies in reverse in zones of anarchy where indeed violence can re-erupt, such as the American Wild West, where the cliche of the cowboy movies was that the nearest sheriff is 90 miles away, in failed states, in collapsed empires, and in mafias and street gangs who deal in contraband and therefore cannot settle their disputes by calling in the state. They can't file a lawsuit, they can't dial 911 because of the nature of the work that they do, and so they have to enforce their interests with their own rough justice, resulting in the Corleones, the Sopranos, and those kinds of vendettas. Other evidence at the international scale includes the effectiveness of international peacekeepers. The second historical force that draws out our better angels, I suggest, is gentle commerce. The idea that plunder is a zero-sum game, but trade is a positive-sum game in which everybody can win. Over the course of history, as technology improves and allows the trade of goods and ideas over longer distances among larger groups of people and at lower cost, more and more of the rest of humanity becomes more valuable alive than dead. A concrete example might be that there isn't a whole lot of affection between the United States and China these days, but it's not terribly likely that they'll go to war. Among other things, they make too much of our stuff, and we owe them too much money. Some historical evidence for the theory of gentle commerce consists of statistical analyses showing that countries with open economies and greater amounts of international trade get embroiled in fewer wars, host fewer civil wars, and host fewer genocides. The third historical force has been called the expanding circle. This is a concept that was named by Peter Singer, but first endorsed by Charles Darwin more than a century before. The idea is that evolution bequeathed us with a sense of empathy. Unfortunately, by default, we apply it only to a narrow circle of friends and family. But over the course of history, you can see the circle of empathy expanding to embrace not just the family, but the village, then the clan, then the tribe, then the nation, then it's extended to other races, to both sexes, to children, and eventually to other sentient beings, other species. This just begs the question of what expanded the circle, and as I hinted earlier, technologies that increase cosmopolitanism may have that effect. The growing appreciation of history, of literature, of media, of journalism, growing opportunities for travel. And we know from the social psychology laboratory that if you get a person to adopt the perspective of some other real or fictitious person, they are more sympathetic to that person, and they're more sympathetic to the category of people that that individual represents. Historical evidence includes the fact that in the 17th and 18th century, there was an expansion of literacy and travel, the so-called Republic of Letters, which preceded the Humanitarian Revolution. It may not be a coincidence that the second half of the 20th century, which had the long peace and the rights revolutions, was also the era of the electronic global village. And it's often been speculated that the rise of internet and social media has assisted the color revolutions and the Arab Spring. The final historical force I call the escalator of reason. The possibility that the growth of literacy, education, and public discourse has encouraged people to think more abstractly and more universally. They get into the habit of rising above their parochial vantage point, which makes it harder to privilege your own interests over the interests of others. It encourages you to replace a morality based on tribalism, authority, and Puritanism with a morality based on fairness and universal rules. It encourages people to recognize the futility of cycles of violence, and increasingly to see violence as a problem to be solved rather than as a contest to be won. What is the evidence? Well, one intriguing piece of evidence is that abstract reasoning abilities, as measured by IQ tests, believe it or not, increased over the course of the 20th century. Throughout the 20th century and all over the world, IQ increased by about 3 points a decade, the so-called Flynn effect. How could this have affected violence? Well, other studies have shown that people and societies with higher levels of education and of measured intelligence, holding all else equal, commit fewer violent crimes on average, cooperate more in experimental games, have more classically liberal attitudes, such as opposition to racism and sexism, and are more receptive to democracy. Well, why have I ended up with this list of four seemingly very different forces? Why are they all pushing in the same direction toward less violence? The closest I think we can come to an overarching theory is that violence is what game theorists call a social dilemma. That is, it's always tempting to an aggressor to engage in predatory or exploitative violence, but on the other hand, it's quite ruinous to the victim. In the long run, all parties are better off if violence is avoided. And our dilemma as humans, our pickle, is how to get the other guy to refrain from violence at the same time as you do. If you are the only one to beat your swords into plowshares, then you are a sitting duck for invasion by the bad guys. Everyone's got to decide to beat their swords into plowshares at the same time. One can see these forces as cases in which human experience and human ingenuity gradually solves this problem, just like other scourges of nature like pestilence and hunger that we've dealt with, and that all of these forces have increased the material, emotional, and cognitive incentives of all parties to avoid violence simultaneously. Well, regardless of the correct explanation for the decline of violence, I think its implications for understanding the human condition are profound. For one thing, they call for a reorientation of efforts toward violence reduction from a moralistic mindset to an empirical mindset. Instead of asking, why is there war, we might be better off asking, why is there peace? Instead of, what are we doing wrong, we might ask, what have we been doing right? Because we have been doing something right, and it sure would be good to find out exactly what it is. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steven Pinker. This was a fantastic presentation. Already, people are lining up for the questions. I'm going to ask again. I know I'm never successful, but I'm still going to keep trying. I'd like you to keep your questions really brief, and so everyone gets a chance. And Steven, I'd like you to keep your answers brief. So it works both ways. And if you're comfortable, please say your name.
I'm Dr. Caroline Poplin. My question is Germany. It was the most cosmopolitan, the most highly educated society, arguably, in Europe. And they did the most horrible crime.
Yeah. Well, it's a little misleading to say it, because there were sectors of Germany that indeed were cosmopolitan educated. There were also sectors of Germany that were more tribal in their mindset, deeply anti-Semitic. There was even among the German elite, there was a widespread rejection of the Enlightenment, which was dismissed as that French business, and rather than an acceptance of the idea of universal rights and an emphasis on the flourishing of individuals, there was a rather primitive embrace of blood and soil, of tribalism. Now, granted, you're certainly right. There was this flourishing of cosmopolitan sentiments among some sectors of the German population. The problem was they were all murdered. So the general answer is that it was that when it comes to an entire society, it's important to see how dynamics can lead to competition among the various sectors, and it's only if you have a robust democracy in which the cosmopolitan people are not murdered that it can affect the course of the society as a whole.
First a comment and then a question. I think a fantasy that Carla would appreciate was that Buñuel, the great Spanish filmmaker and perhaps the cleverest of all, as he was dying, said in his autobiography, if only every 10 years I could get up out of the grave and get a newspaper and keep in touch with what's going on in the world.
That's wonderful.
Your presentation is, in terms of overt violence, is extraordinarily impressive. On the other hand, there's a containment, in one sense, in the proliferation of violent games, starting with kids as young as two and 3, and the tremendous compulsive preoccupation with violence in all the media, in football and so forth. And I would call it a kind of externalization, not a sublimation, but contained. And part of it, I think, is Freud spoke of the pervasivity of violence and his aggressive drive, and that you can kind of identify with people who are suffering and say, "Thank God it isn't me," and then, but even more important, murder mysteries. Mm-hmm. Somebody. I can fantasize that I've done this murder, but somebody else is going to be discovered, and I can go conscience-free.
Yes, I agree that a pleasure taken in violent entertainment is a great constant of the human experience. I don't believe that violent entertainment causes violence. The huge expansion of violent video games has been accompanied by the great American crime decline since the early 1990s. I also not convinced by a kind of hydraulic model that if you get your violent urges out through violent entertainment, you're less likely to commit it in real life. I think that it's a guilty pleasure that people of all eras have had. If you look at Titus Andronicus, if you look at the Penny Dreadfuls, if you look at the Old Testament, if you look at the Lives of the Saints, there's a lot of really gruesome stuff in there. People enjoy it for interesting reasons, I think, including the ones that you mentioned, but it's a tenuous connection to real-life violence.
I would think that very few people watch torture and execution in terms of the total population, and now it's a large part of the population. So it's one difference.
Well, people came out and brought out the whole family to watch really stomach-turning public executions, burnings and breakings and strangulations and disembowelments. So in the past, it was possible for an entire population to be overcome by a kind of collective sadism.
One last comment. I noticed there was laughter in Twitter when we talked about disembowelment and mummies with cords around their neck.
Folks, we have a long line,
Okay,
and
I'll
I would like everyone to get their chance.
Yes.
Promise to be brief. Good evening and Happy New Year to those to whom it is applicable.
Shana
You
Tova.
said if anyone wanted to give names, we could. I'll give a nickname and leave it to the imagination to figure out its polymath. Anyways, question is this, and by the way, I was very much impressed by your presentation. I've always wanted to meet you. No bizarre fantasies there, but just wanted trust me, no murder involved. Believe me, I'm very passive. But question is this: do you think some people are actually biological, have a tendency to really almost be inherently evil? I've sometimes looked at clowns in the dark, and I look like as though maybe there's a fear of clowns. I still have that these toy clowns could arouse evil. Little children holding like scissors behind their back and saying, 3-year-olds, look like little charming, pretty little girls. You want to play? You want to play? And if you get too close, watch out. That scissors are gonna be a nice dagger in your guts. And no matter how you raise them, even if they're adopted by the most nicest, kindest people, most intellectually brilliant, there's something about them that they like to see others suffer.
Yeah. There is, the answer is that there is a substantial heritable component to antisocial tendencies, and at the extreme end, violent antisocial tendencies. It's not obviously completely heritable, but within a population, the troublemakers, the more callous, more impulsive people, they get that way in part for genetic reasons, because thanks to the real-life research that carries out the thought experiment you mentioned, namely compare adoptive children to their biological parents and their adoptive parents, shows that there is some statistical tendency. The most extreme are psychopaths, a few percentage points of the population, that seem to be without the ability to develop a conscience that counts the interests of others. So it's among individuals there does seem to be some heritability,
And
yes.
you never know. The average person wouldn't
I think we
know.
need to move
Yes.
on. I think it's only
you.
fair that everyone get a chance.
Thank you.
Trained it on.
Hi, my name is Noah Brayali, and my question is about the backroom boys. It's a phrase that was used to refer to the chemists and chemical engineers at DuPont who developed the napalm that was used to great effect in the war against Indochina. The United States was involved with the Vietnam War, and so in reviewing the record of the backroom boys, Professor Noam Chomsky, a friend of yours, colleague of yours, I'm sure you know who he is. Remarks that there's an objectivity and a distance from the effects of their actions that these backroom boys had in their very technological occupations. And he traces it to the 30 Years' War. and mentions that this institutionalized violence by objective and rational and reasonable people through largely technological means has its roots in those prolonged genocidal conflicts that you mentioned have abated in severity. So at that time, maybe 30% of what's now Czech Republic just perished through the effects of that war. And as you rightly mentioned, the percentages of genocidal conflict killed by these kind of wars have declined precipitously. But the institutions seem to remain with us, in particular this dispassionate, reasonable and objective countenancing of extreme violence, particularly technological in form, like these backroom boys at DuPont in the 1950s, developing napalm and other very effective killing agents.
Yes. Well, what I've really been concerned with is when these agents have been deployed. And it's interesting that contrary to what I often hear, namely, as we develop high-tech push-button forms of warfare, won't that circumvent the inhibitions that we have against hands-on, bloody, gory violence, and therefore would that lead you to expect violence to go way up? And I don't think that that's consistent with the process of history. You mentioned the 30 Years' War with those horrific rates of violent death, and those were carried out by pikemen and with edged weapons and bayonets and so on. I think people can very easily overcome their resistance to hands-on violence, and in fact, it's often the most high-tech forms of violence that are deployed most gingerly, nuclear weapons being an example, which have not been used since Nagasaki. So I think the correlation is much less than people think, simply because it is so easy to commit hands-on violence.
You're talking about the historical record, on this historical link between this technology of violence and that particular pattern of, in particular in Europe, in Northern Europe, this pattern of technologically very rich and devoted culture of violence. You've reviewed this history of violence. How clear is that connection?
Yeah. The highest technology of any culture is typically applied to weapons of war. So the Mongolian hordes on horseback had amazingly well-engineered composite bows that could do vast amounts of damage very quickly. So that's something that seems to bring out people's ingenuity.
I am Paul Steinberg, a psychiatrist here in town, and I'm wondering if you could just comment on these thoughts that you may be dismissing the change in human nature a little too quickly, in the sense that genes are always in a dance with the environment. And I know you cite, I haven't read your book, but I know you cite Greg Clark, and his research is remarkable in looking at what happened starting in the 13th century with the royals just being much more fertile than the lower classes. And
then the bourgeoisie. Yes.
And the bourgeoisie created the Enlightenment, but it took 500, 600 years for the Industrial Revolution to happen. So we had more people in England who had what Ned Hallowell calls attention surplus disorder, and fewer people with attention deficit disorder, less impulsivity, greater concentration, greater self-control. And when a society moves in that direction, you reach a critical mass, that may actually change the way it certainly fuels just a change in the culture.
Yes, and I discuss that possibility at length in the book. I end up not embracing it, though not rejecting it, mainly because of lack of evidence. It makes the prediction, for example, that Englishmen, regardless of their culture, should be genetically less prone to impulsivity and violence than people from other cultures and races. This isn't a possibility that I'm eager to test anytime soon, or anyone else. But moreover, it may be unnecessary. It's very early in the investigation of recent biological evolution. But given that some of the developments that I discuss occurred far too rapidly to be attributable to genetic evolution, such as the plunging of the crime rate since 1992 or the rights revolutions. So something must have happened that was not genetic that could account for that plummeting. So on grounds of parsimony, I figure we don't have any need for the hypothesis that there's also been a genetic change, while not ruling it out.
Hey, I'm a terrible public speaker, but a huge fan, so I'll try to keep it together and ask you a question here. I'm curious about people's relationship in a representative democracy with civilian law enforcement, and it's really interesting to hear about declining rates of violence, but at the same time, things like paramilitary police forcing and SWAT teams have like gone way beyond their original intention for like hostage situations, and even famously last year, someone, they're breaking into people's homes over, college loans, et cetera. So if rates of violence are really declining amongst the people, why are the civilian law enforcement seem to be flexing their muscles in a way that doesn't correlate with the decline in violence?
Mm-hmm. Well, we'd have to look at figures over time of government violence perpetrated against its own civilians. And I suspect that there hasn't been much at all of an increase compared to earlier decades and centuries. In bringing in the Leviathan to keep people from each other's throats, you then introduce the second problem of keeping the Leviathan from people's throats. That first transition was a tough bargain because it did lower the rate of violence, but then it gave you these bloodthirsty despots to deal with. Democratic revolution, and indeed the continuing battle for democracy and civil liberties, is an attempt to find that sweet spot where the government is powerful enough to deter predation by one citizen over another, but not so powerful that it becomes a menace to its own citizens. And that's something that I suspect, always going to muddle through.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to make sure that everyone in line gets to ask their question, and that will be our limit tonight. So.
Hi, my name's Gregory Walsh. I want to say I've been really looking forward to reading this book ever since seeing a speech you gave 3 or 4 years ago at the TED conference on this same topic. I was, however, wondering if you could comment on some allegations made in a book I recently read called, got a blank on the name, Sex at Dawn, the prehistoric origins of modern sexuality, in which those authors allege that some of the data you present about rates of violence among hunter-gatherer cultures, which you called, I think, non-state peoples tonight, is erroneous. They allege, for example, that the data at the time it was collected, these people had contact with modern society for many decades, that they're not, in fact, nomadic, they're settled peoples. I've just been curious ever since reading that to hear your response to some of those allegations.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with those allegations, but the data that I present are, many of them are from people who definitely had no contact with any Europeans, such as samples of skeletons from pre-Columbian Native Americans. Many of them are also from hunter-gatherer and hunter-horticulturalist people who also had no contact. So I don't know, I can't respond to these allegations not knowing what they are, but certainly the sources that I've consulted make it very clear when there has or has not been contact. And they span a range. There are some societies that don't have measured rates of homicide or deaths in war, but on average the rates are way up there, and they're from many, many societies of different kinds. What they have in common is not living under government, and that seems to uniformly give, or no, I shouldn't say uniformly because there are some at the tail of the distribution, but on average give rise to high rates of violence. And from what I can tell from both the ethnographic and archaeological literature, that's a solid conclusion. And I cite many surveys that have the numbers that back up that claim.
Thank you.
Yes, hi, I'm Rich Blaustein. Thanks for your stimulating presentation. I guess when you were listing factors showing decline in violence in our society, everything from paddling to death penalty to rape, I guess one exception that kind of stood out in my mind would be incarceration. A very high level of incarceration. Of course, there are violent people that deserve to be, but there's also nonviolent crimes. There are huge sentences. People thrown into a situation where that prison life is not getting less violent. I was wondering how you factor into that at the larger picture.
Well, in historical terms, modern American prisons, as horrible as they are much less violent than prisons several hundred years ago, when you could have, say, prisoners shackled to the floor or wearing iron spiked collars, and their family would have to pay for easement of irons for the spiked collar to be taken off, when there was extremely high rates of death from disease and starvation in the prisons. This is not to defend current American prisons by any means, but historically it would be inaccurate to take the current American imprisonment binge as evidence that nothing has improved. Now, the American imprisonment bulge of the last 20 years partly was a way of reducing counteracting the enormous increase in street violence and violent crimes of all types that had overtaken the United States from the 60s through the 1980s. The homicide rate more than doubled in those decades, the rate of rape, the rate of assault. And so as a rather clumsy countermeasure, there was an increase in incarceration, which in part was responsible for the fact that the violent crime rates have plunged back to earth since the 1990s. Not entirely, because there were a number of other causes of the violence decline, but most statisticians of crime attribute at least part of the crime decline to the increase in imprisonment. Now, in the United States, as with many other of the trends that I've been mentioning, it's a little misleading. It's the country we all know best, and we tend to think of it as representative of Western democracies, but it's really an outlier. And a lot of the trends that I've mentioned are true for every Western democracy but the United States, which is kind of pulling up the rear. And it's true of homicide, it's true of capital punishment, it's true of willingness to engage in wars, and it's true of imprisonment, where we throw a disproportionately large proportion of our population in prison compared to other Western democracies. But certainly on the century scale, there's just no comparison between today's prisons and those of the 19th and 18th centuries.
Hi, my name is Megan, and I was wondering if you could share with us a bit about the methods you used to arrive to these numbers that you talked about tonight. Did you do kind of independent testing with statistics, like kind of look at this type of cause, like did this factor cause X, change these things? So could you share with us kind of the source of your numbers and how you arrived at them?
Well, it depends on the numbers, because for different periods of history and different kinds of violence, the numbers have different sources. So for the state non-state contrast, it came from ethnographies of extant tribal peoples and from forensic archaeology. For the history of homicide in Europe, it came from historical criminology, such as the unearthing coroner's records for every year in a particular parish or town in Europe going back to the Middle Ages. In the case of war, it depends on the period. Since 1946, there have been meticulous statistics kept on deaths in armed conflict by a couple of Scandinavian organizations. Before 1946, there was the Correlates of War Project, which looked at death rates from the largest wars from 1816 to the present. Prior to 1816, it becomes, as you can imagine, the farther back you go, the fuzzier the statistics get. But there is a line of historians, quantitative historians, that have tried to triangulate on estimates of the death tolls from various wars to come up with best guess estimates. For homicide, more recently, the FBI keeps reasonably good statistics, at least they have since the 1930s. For crimes other than homicide, like rape and assault, the best data are victimization surveys, which aren't contaminated by people's willingness to report a crime to the police. For still others, like child abuse and domestic violence, there are victimization surveys or other social science methodologies. So it all depends on the kind of violence.
Now, did you take a new approach with analyzing the results from these, or?
In general, what I did is I took the data sets in their entirety from other researchers and never second-guessed the criteria, either the start date, the stop date, what gets included, what gets excluded, because I didn't want to do any cherry picking to try to favor this hypothesis. So the data sets that I use vary in their quality, for sure, but none of them were selected in order to show a decline or manipulated in order to show a decline. I just dumped all the data in there, even when I knew that some of the inclusions were dodgy for various reasons, but I didn't give myself the freedom of cherry picking them.
Thank you.
Hi. I was just wondering, Putnam finds that social capital has been declining in the United States, interconnection, community, and I would have thought that that would lead to maybe more violence, more crime, but it seems like we've had a decline in crime despite, those kinds of maybe troubling figures. And I was wondering if you given any thought to that and had any ideas why, Putnam's results might be going in a different direction from your results on crime in this country?
Yeah, it's a good question because there are other data sets that would seem to suggest that the rate of violent crime depends on the degree of social interconnectedness and trust in institutions. That of when I referred to the civilizing process, that was a decline from about 100 per 100,000 per year to about 10 per 100,000 per year. And that occurs everywhere that government extends its tentacles. But then the further decline that we see in Europe and in parts of the United States from about 10 down to the single digits, the low single digits, seems to depend not on the presence of government, but on some more nebulous process of accepting the legitimacy of the social order that indeed, as you suggest, you'd expect to correlate with the health of communal institutions. But as you also point out, don't. The embarrassing, dirty little fact is that no statistical criminologist has been successful in accounting for either the increase in crime rate in the 1960s through the 1980s, nor the plunging from the 1990s to the present. Everyone has been doing catch-up. All the numbers you plug into the usual models, you throw them in, you turn the crank, you run through the statistical models, and they don't predict why the curves go up and down. So that's the embarrassing secret. I do my best in the book to talk about changes in cultural attitudes that could filter down to law enforcement and push these up or down, but we're all basically telling stories post hoc.
Thank you.
Last question.
My name's Rich Potter. Thank you. Can't wait to read this book. It's a fascinating subject. I'm interested in why is the perception that we live in such a dangerous and violent era, why is that so pervasive? Yeah. It's just amazing how discordant that is.
Yeah, it is indeed an intriguing question. I think one reason is what the media report and what they're getting better at reporting. Not only is there the programming policy, if it bleeds, it leads. Media programmers know that just as people enjoy violent entertainment, they enjoy violent news, and so that gets promoted number one. We're better at finding violence. Now, anyone on the planet with a cell phone can beam video footage of violence all over the world. Cognitive psychologists know that the human mind estimates risk and likelihood by the ease with which we can recall examples. If you can think of an example, you think it must be dangerous. We're not as good at calculating denominators. And the media, of course, don't report denominators. If you've got millions of people dying of Alzheimer's and cancer and heart attacks, if Vladimir in Lithuania keels over from a heart attack, there isn't a camera crew filming it. But if Vladimir gets shot by a deranged postal worker, then it'll be on the evening news. And the final reason is that we care more about violence now. So a lot of things that just didn't even count as violence, now we consider to be heinous crimes. The most blatant example is genocide, which before the 20th century, no one seemed to think there was anything particularly wrong with genocide. It's all over the Old Testament. That doesn't seem to be a problem for anyone. There were many colonial ministers and politicians who thanked God for wiping out the Indians. There's a change in sensibility that has gone further and further down the scale to isolate behaviors that before were okay. My favorite example being the recent targeting of bullying. No less than the President of the United States gave a policy address on what we're going to do about bullying in the playground. Now, 25 years ago, this would have been like an episode of The Simpsons. It would have been absurd. Boys will be boys. It's part of childhood. How are kids going to be, grow up tough if you're going to turn them into sissies? But now we think of life from the point of view of the bullied child. There are many, many accounts of the suffering of victims of bullying, and now there's a new category of violence that wasn't even counted as violence before.
For more on Steven Pinker and his work, visit stevenpinker.com.